The dusk came in hard, a deep, bruising blue that settled over the high plains. It was late in 1888, and the wind had teeth. It blew out of the north with nothing to stop it, scouring the land flat, leaving the prairie grass as nothing but pale, broken stubble. Far to the west, the buttes rose like black teeth against the fading light. The cold was a physical thing, a weight that pressed the air from a man's lungs. Eli Carter felt it in his hands first, a deep ache that settled into the bone. He pulled the collar of his worn canvas coat tighter, but it did no good. The wind found every seam. He was leading the bay gelding, the rein stiff as iron rod in his raw-knuckled grip. The horse was done. Its head hung low, plumes of steam jetting from its nostrils with every ragged breath. Snow had begun to spit an hour ago, hard little needles that stung his cheeks and clung to his eyelashes. Now it was thickening, swirling in the rising dark, erasing the faint track he had been following. He was a cattle hand, but he'd spent years before that surveying for the railroad, and he knew this empty quarter of Wyoming territory. Or maybe it was Montana by now. The borders were just lines on a map no one out here respected. He knew how fast this land could kill a man. Shelter was not a want. It was the only thing that mattered. He'd been aiming for a line shack he remembered from a survey 2 years prior, but he'd missed it in the fading light, or the wind had pushed him farther west than he reckoned. He scanned the horizon, a flat, endless sweep of darkening white, and saw nothing, just the wind and the snow and the awful, rising whine of the empty world. Then a shape, not a bluff, but something harder, something with angles. He squinted, his eyes watering from the cold. It was low to the ground, a long shadow against the snow. Man-made. He tugged the gelding's lead rope and stumbled toward it, his boots sinking deep in the new drifts. It was a train station, or the ghost of one. He recognized the shape of the bare platform, a deck of raw lumber already warping and graying. It was an unfinished spur line, one of the countless projects that had died when the money ran out. He saw the sharp, jagged edges of broken window panes in the small depot building, a semaphore arm. Its signal lenses shattered, was tilted at a drunken angle, frozen in place. The rails, laid but never used, were already vanishing under the snow. Beyond the depot, the great wooden water tank stood like a hollow sentinel, its staves split wide open by ice. It was a picture of failure. But next to the depot, tucked against the wind, was a low shack. It might have been the station master's office or a telegrapher's hut, and from its tin chimney pipe, a thin, almost invisible curl of smoke rose, ripped away instantly by the wind. Smoke meant fire. Fire meant life. It also meant people. In this country, that was as much a danger as a blessing. Eli led the horse toward the shack, the gelding sensing the faint promise of shelter and moving a little faster. He stopped 10 feet from the door, his hand resting near the butt of the Colt holstered under his coat. He didn't draw it, but he felt its weight. "Hello, the house," he called, his voice sounding small against the storm. There was no answer, only the shriek of the wind over the roof. He stepped closer, the snow crunching under his boots. He rapped his gloved knuckles on the rough planked door. Silence, then a sound from within, the scrape of a stool on a wooden floor. "Who's there?" The voice was a woman's. It was not frightened. It was steady, low, and laced with iron. "Traveler," Eli called back. "Just looking for shelter from the storm. My horse is near foundered." A long pause. He could feel the cold soaking through the soles of his boots. "Turn around, face the platform." Eli did as he was told. Turning his back to the door, he heard the sound of a bar being lifted, and the door creaked open. "Keep your hands where I can see them. Now turn back, slow." He turned. The door was open just wide enough for him to see her. She stood in the dim, flickering lamplight, a shadow filling the frame. She was holding a Winchester rifle, and she held it calmly, the barrel laid across her arm. pointed not at his heart, but at the ground near his feet. It was the posture of someone who knew how to use it but did not wish to. Not yet. He raised his hands, palms open and away from his coat. "No trouble, ma'am, just the storm." She looked past him, at the gelding. The horse let out a low, weary groan. The woman's eyes studied the animal, then moved back to Eli. She scanned him from his battered hat to his snow-caked boots. He was lean, sun-scarred, and looked as tired as his horse. He carried the weariness of a man who had worked hard and lost much. "You can bring the horse into the freight room," she said, her voice flat. "Next to the main depot. The roof is sound enough. Then you can come in." She stepped back into the shadows and closed the door. The bar dropped back into place. Eli let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. He led the gelding to the open freight bay, the horse stumbling on the drifted platform. Inside, it was dark and smelled of sawdust and pack rat leavings, but it was out of the wind. He loosened the cinch and pulled the heavy saddle from the horse's back, its muscles trembling with cold. He threw a frozen blanket over the gelding's steaming hide. "It ain't much, boy," he whispered, rubbing the horse's neck. "But it'll do." He grabbed his saddlebags, his bedroll, and a small bundle of kindling he kept tied to his rig. He walked back to the shack and knocked again. The door opened. This time, she let him in. He stepped inside, blinking as his eyes adjusted to the warm, yellow light. The shack was tiny, barely 12 feet square. A cast-iron tin stove glowed cherry red in one corner, its heat a living thing. A narrow cot was built against one wall, a simple table and 2 stools in the center. The air smelled of cold iron, old coffee, and something else, something like dry herbs. The woman stood by the table. Mara Delaney. He didn't know her name then, but he saw her clearly. She was not a girl. Her face was strong-boned, her eyes a watchful, steady gray. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple knot. Her coat was patched at the elbows, the wool worn thin, but it was clean. The rifle was now laid calm across her knees as she sat on one of the stools. She looked capable, and she looked terribly alone. Eli dropped his gear by the door, the snow melting from his bedroll and puddling on the floorboards. He pulled off his gloves and held his hands toward the stove, the feeling stinging as it returned to his fingers. "Much obliged, ma'am." She nodded once, her gaze missing nothing. He unslung his saddlebags and pulled out a cloth-wrapped parcel of jerky. It was dry and hard as wood. "It ain't much," he said, laying it on the table. "But I'd be willing to trade it for some hot water." Her eyes flicked to the jerky, then back to his face. She gestured to a blue enamel pot simmering on the back of the stove. "Water's hot. Help yourself. Keep the jerky. You look like you need it more than I do." He found a tin cup on a shelf and ladled water from the pot. It was just water, but it was hot, and it burned a trail of life down his throat. He leaned against the wall near the stove, letting the warmth soak into his back. "This storm's settling in for the night," he said, filling the silence. "Could be 2-3 days." "It could," she agreed. He had to ask. It was none of his business, but the question was too big to ignore. "What are you doing out here, ma'am? This station is abandoned. The line's dead." Mara Delaney watched him. The lamplight carved shadows under her cheekbones. The wind hammered against the small building, a low, steady roar that made the shack feel like a ship in a storm. She seemed to be listening to the wind, or perhaps to something inside herself. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, but it cut through the noise. "I'm waiting." "For who? No train's coming." "For the truth," she said. She looked at him, her gaze direct and unsettlingly clear. "I have a proposition for you. Mister, you're trapped here by the storm. I'm trapped here by other things. You stay the night. You keep the watch with me. And in return, I'll tell you the truth. A truth that got 2 men killed and could ruin one of the biggest men in this territory." Eli frowned. This was not the simple shelter he had hoped for. This was trouble, deep and complicated. He was just a cattle hand trying to get to a new job, to leave his own ghosts behind. "Why tell me?" he asked, his voice cautious. "Because you're not from here, and because you have to stay anyway." She gave a small, grim smile. "The wind just made you my witness." He looked at the door, where a fine mist of snow was being driven through the crack under the threshold. He looked at the rifle on her lap. He looked at her steady, tired eyes. Staying was no longer a choice. It was a necessity. What he did while he stayed, that was another matter. "All right," he said, nodding slowly. "I'm staying." The bargain was struck. A heavier gust of wind hit the shack, and the door shuddered in its frame. "That door won't hold if the wind picks up more," Eli said. "All business now." He pointed to the heavy wooden bench he had used as a bar. "That's not enough. We should barricade it proper." She nodded. Together. They dragged the bench and braced it against the door, Eli using his boot to wedge one leg tight against the floor. It was the first time they had worked together, their shoulders brushing in the cramped space. He brought in his saddle and bedroll, laying them out on the floor, giving the stove as much room as he could. He added the small bundle of kindling to the wood box, a silent offering. The shack was tight, the air growing thick with their shared breath and the smell of damp wool. Eli settled on his bedroll, his back against the wall, and sipped the hot water. Mara poured herself a cup of the bitter coffee he'd smelled. They sat in silence for a long time, the only sounds the ticking of the hot tin stove and the constant, screaming wind. He needed to fill the quiet, to build some kind of bridge. "This was supposed to be the Teton Spur," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the buried tracks. "Heard they ran out of money before they could even lay the ballast." She looked up, surprised. "You know this line?" "I used to," he said. He rubbed his cold, reddened hands together. "I was a railroad man, a surveyor, worked for the Union Pacific for 6 years. He saw her expression change. It wasn't interest, exactly. It was calculation. Her gaze sharpened, and she watched his hands as he spoke, as if measuring him for his honesty. "So you know maps," she stated. It wasn't a question. "I know maps," Eli confirmed. "I know mileposts and chainage. I know how to read a landscape. And I know how a map can be made to tell the truth, and how it can be made to lie." Mara's hands tightened on her coffee cup. She looked from his face to his hands and back again. He could almost see her mind working, weighing this new piece of information. This stranger, blown in by the storm, knew the language of her prison. A sudden, high-pitched yipping echoed from the platform, close and sharp. It was followed by a frantic stamping and a panicked whinny from the freight room. Eli was on his feet in an instant. "Coyotes! They smell the horse!" He moved to the door, instincts taking over. Mara was right behind him, the rifle now in her hands, held ready. He cracked the door, peering through the sliver of an opening. The wind tore at his face, blinding him with snow. He could see dark shapes flitting across the platform, drawn by the scent of the trapped, frightened gelding. "They're bold," he muttered. "They've been starving all winter," she said, her voice quiet at his shoulder. He pulled the door shut and helped her reset the bench. He turned to face her, and the movement was too sudden. The shack was too small. He was closer than he had realized. His shoulder brushed hers. Their faces were only inches apart. He could see the faint trace of soot on her cheek, the way the lamplight caught the gray in her eyes. He could feel the warmth coming off her, a simple, human heat that was a stark contrast to the frozen world outside. He smelled the lye soap on her skin and the faint, bitter scent of the coffee on her breath. The closeness was a jolt. It was sudden, unexpected, and intensely real. It was the touch of another living person, and he realized with a sharp, painful clarity how long it had been since he had stood this close to anyone. It was simple, it was human, and in this tiny, barricaded room, with a storm raging and a secret hanging in the air. It was the most dangerous thing he had felt all day. He stepped back, breaking the contact. "He'll be all right in there. The door's solid." Mara stepped back too, her expression unreadable. She turned away and walked to the stove, her shoulders set. "The coffee's getting low," she said, her voice perfectly level. She made space for him on the floor, pushing her own stool back. "Sit. You're letting the cold in." He returned to his bedroll. The room felt even smaller now, charged with the energy of that brief, accidental touch. Their breath plumed in the air that was not directly by the stove. She poured him a cup of the coffee. It was thick, smoky, and tasted of tin. He drank it gratefully. The silence stretched again, but it was different now. It was heavier. The stove ticked. The wind clawed at the shutters. "Finally," Mara spoke, her voice low, directed at the stove's glowing grate. "There was a fire," she said, her voice flat, as if reciting a fact she had worn smooth with repetition. "At the Dawson Depot. Last winter, it burned to the ground." Eli waited. He had learned as a surveyor that the land gave up its secrets slowly. People, he figured, were much the same. It was the middle of the night. The telegraph lines were already down from an ice storm. She paused, her cup halfway to her lips. "People in town? They say I lit it." Eli watched her profile. He saw the tension in her jaw. "Why would they say that?" "Because I was there," she said. "And because a powerful man needed someone to blame?" She finally looked at him, her eyes burning with a cold fire that matched the world outside. "I tried to warn them. Weeks before, I told them the wiring in the new office was faulty. I told them the stovepipe was too close to the load-bearing wall." "They didn't listen," Eli said. "It was a statement." "No, they didn't listen. And when it burned, my warning became my motive. They said I was angry, vengeful." "Were you?" he asked. His voice was quiet, not an accusation, just a question. She shook her head, a small, tired movement. "I was afraid, but not of the fire." She looked down at her hands, clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. Her voice dropped. And when she spoke again, it broke, just a little, like thin ice cracking under a boot. "2 men died, section hands, sleeping in the bunk room. They never got out." She took a sharp, unsteady breath. "And a child, a little boy, he was lost in the smoke." The way she said it, the word lost sounded like a stone dropping into a well so deep you never hear it hit the bottom. Eli felt a cold fist clench in his own gut. He had seen death in the war, seen it on the plains, but this was different. This was the sound of a grief so profound it had hollowed her out. He didn't offer clumsy words of comfort. He didn't press her with questions. He just sat there, solid and silent, and let the stove's ticking fill the terrible space her words had created. He let the storm howl for both of them. Outside, the snow clawed at the shutters, and the wind moaned like a living thing, trapped and grieving in the dark. The night wore on. The storm reached its peak, a deafening, solid roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the small shack. They agreed to sleep in shifts. Eli insisted on taking the first watch. He sat on the stool, his own rifle across his lap, watching the door and the snow that piled in whispers under it. Mara lay on the cot, wrapped in her blankets. But he knew she wasn't sleeping. He could feel her watching him from the shadows. After what felt like 4 hours, he nudged her boot. "Your watch." She sat up instantly, fully awake. The fire had burned low, and the room was biting cold again. The stove was the heart of their survival, and it was failing. Mara moved to the stove and knelt, opening the small iron door. She reached for the last of the kindling Eli had brought in, and he saw her hands. In the dim glow from the firebox, they were shaking, not from fear, but from a deep, bone-weary exhaustion and the penetrating cold. Her fingers fumbled with the small pieces of wood, unable to grip them properly. She was trying to bank the fire for the next shift, to make the wood last, but her hands would not obey. Eli moved before he thought about it. He knelt beside her in the cramped space, close enough to feel the shivers running through her. He didn't ask, and he didn't speak. He simply reached out and covered her trembling fingers with his own broad, calloused palms. She froze. Her whole body went rigid. His hands were large, rough from work, and held a steady warmth from his time by the stove. He held her hands against the kindling, his grip firm but gentle. Steadying them, he helped her guide the wood into the firebox, placing each piece with deliberate care. It was a simple, practical act, a shared task. She allowed it. For one long breath. For two. She let him hold her, let his strength and his warmth steady her. The heat that moved from his palms into her fingers was startling, undeniable. It was not the heat of passion. It was the heat of a forge, solid and real. It was the touch of another person saying, "I am here. You are not alone in this." Then, just as slowly as he had taken them, she pulled her hands away. She slid them out from under his, her movements deliberate. She finished banking the fire, her hands still shaking, but less. Mara stood up and stepped back, putting the stove and the small, intimate glow between them. She wrapped her patched coat tightly around herself. Her eyes were bright in the lamplight, and the guard was back, stronger and more complex than before. She had recognized the jolt at the door, and now she recognized this. It was a new and different kind of danger, one the storm had blown right into her sanctuary. Morning came not as a softness, but as a judgment. The world outside the shack's single grime-caked window was a blinding, featureless white, suffocated under a new blanket of snow. The wind had finally died, leaving a silence so profound it felt heavy, broken only by the sharp, metallic caw of ravens. A hard, indifferent sun beat down, making the new snow glitter with a cold that seemed to burn the eyes. Eli rose from his bedroll, his back stiff. The stove was nearly cold. The last of the kindling turned to gray ash. Mara was already standing by the window, her breath fogging the pane, her patched coat wrapped tight around her. She had not slept, or if she had, it was the sleep of a sentry, one eye open. "Storms broke," Eli said, his voice gravelly. "For now," she replied, not turning. He pulled on his boots and coat, his movements stiff. "I'll check the horse and the surroundings." She nodded. He took his rifle, a simple reflex, and stepped out. The cold hit him like a solid wall, stealing his breath. The air was thin and sharp as a razor. The station platform was coated in a thick, crystalline rime of hoarfrost, every splinter of wood etched in white. On the frozen platform, two large ravens were picking at a patch of ice, their feathers a glossy, oily black against the snow. They watched him with flat, intelligent eyes, then hopped away, unhurried. He walked to the freight room. The gelding whinnied, a low, miserable sound. The horse was alive, shivering, but the blanket had kept the worst of the freeze off him. Eli broke the ice in the water barrel with the butt of his rifle and let the horse drink sparingly. He walked back out onto the platform, his surveyor's eyes scanning the landscape. The snow was a fresh page, and it told a story. He found them near the splintered water tank. Tracks, not the scattered prints of coyotes, but the deliberate, deep impressions of two shod horses. They were partially filled with the last of the night's blowing snow, but they were clear enough. Two riders. They had come in the dark, likely drawn by the faint light from the shack. They had dismounted and waited, standing in the lee of the tank, their prints a shuffled, frozen mud. They had watched the shack. Then, likely around dawn, they had mounted and ridden away, heading east toward Dawson. He followed the tracks back to the shack and stood by the door, his face grim. Mara opened it before he could knock, her eyes immediately going to his. 2 riders, he said. He didn't need to elaborate. Her jaw tightened, a hard line of muscle knotting under the skin. She looked east, toward the town, her expression bleak. He knows I'm here. He? Silas Vance, she said, the name sounding like a curse. She knew who sent them. There was no doubt in her voice. They were just watching, seeing if I was still alone. Now they know I'm not. That changes things for him. She stepped back, holding the door open. Come in. It's too cold to talk out there. We need a fire, and you need to hear the truth you waited for. They spent an hour coaxing the stove back to life, using the last of Eli's hoarded kindling and some split wood from a box under Mara's cot. The meager breakfast was hardtack bread, softened in hot water, and a few slices of salt pork Eli fried in his small skillet. The smell of the hot fat filled the tiny room, a scent of false comfort. They ate sitting on their stools, the tin plates balanced on their knees. You said you worked for the railroad, Mara began, her voice quiet but gaining strength with every word. You know land. You know how it's measured and claimed. I do, Eli said, wiping the grease from his knife. Before the fire, I worked in the land office in Dawson. I was a clerk, just copying plats, mostly transferring the survey notes onto the county maps. She stared into her tin cup. I was good at it. I like numbers. They're clean. They don't lie. She took a breath. Silas Vance doesn't own a single head of cattle, but he calls himself a rancher. He's a middleman. He works for the railroad, buying up right-of-way. And he works for the territorial speculators, selling it back to them. He's the one who decides where the spur lines go, and where the depots get built. He controls the water. He controls the land. She looked up, her gray eyes locking with his. About 8 months ago, I started to notice his claims were expanding. Like a stain, a settler would file on a quarter section, good bottomland with a creek. 6 weeks later, the plat would be challenged. A new survey would come in, always signed off by the same man, showing the settler's claim was mistaken, that it overlapped with a prior railroad grant. Vance's grant. Suddenly, the settler's fence line was on Vance's land. A filing error, Eli said, the old, familiar term tasting sour. Easy enough to make, easy enough to fake. Exactly, but it kept happening. The settlers who balked, who tried to fight it in the land office. They had bad luck. Fences cut, hay barns burned, wells salted. She said the word with a particular venom. It was always chalked up to Indians or stray riders, but it was Vance. He was driving them out, one by one, and claiming their improvements for pennies on the dollar. And you saw the maps. You saw the changes, Eli said, fitting the pieces together. I copied them. Every day. I saw the lines move. I saw the dates on the filings. I knew what he was doing. So you spoke up? A bitter smile touched her lips. I tried. I told my boss, the land registrar. He told me I was a clerk, not a surveyor, and that I should mind my own business. 2 days later, I was fired. He said my handwriting had gotten sloppy. She pushed her plate away, her appetite gone. I had nowhere to go. I was lodging in a room above the Dawson Depot, working for my keep, mending linens. I was angry, and I was foolish. I started writing letters, one to the railroad main office, one to the federal land office in Cheyenne. I told them what I knew. And that, Eli said, is when the depot burned? That is when the depot burned, she whispered. I had been complaining about the wiring for weeks. The new telegraph office they'd put in. The wires were strung wrong, too close to the stovepipe. I could smell the insulation scorching every time the operator sent a long message. I told everyone, the station master, my old boss, even the sheriff. They called me a hysterical woman. Her voice grew flat and hard. All emotion burned out of it. My warning was my motive. Vance's men spread the word before the ashes were even cold, that I was bitter over being fired, that I'd been seen with coal oil, that I lit the fire to destroy the land office records I claimed were false. It all fit together so neatly. The 2 section hands who died, they were just in the way. And the boy, her voice caught, and she stopped. She did not say the rest. She did not have to. Eli was silent for a long time. He looked at her, this woman who was being hunted for knowing how to read a map. He'd seen men like Vance all his life, men who used paper and ink the way other men used a gun, drawing lines on a page to steal the world out from under another man's feet. "You kept copies," he said. It wasn't a question. She nodded. "He thinks I'm a fool. He thinks I'm just a woman who got scared and ran. He doesn't know what I took." She stood and dragged a heavy, iron-bound trunk out from under her cot. The top was scarred. The leather handles cracked. She unlocked it with a small brass key. "What he didn't know," she said, her voice low and fierce, "is that my boss was lazy. When I was fired, he made me stay for 2 days to train the new girl. I spent those 2 days copying everything. The ledgers, the plats, the correspondence. I spent my nights doing it by candlelight until my fingers cramped." She opened the trunk. It was filled with papers, stacked neatly, wrapped in cloth. Eli knelt beside her, his earlier suspicion replaced by a cold, rising anger, and something else, a sharp, clear respect. "This is Vance's private ledger," she said, handing him a heavy, leather-bound book. "I borrowed it from his office the night I left." Eli opened it. Columns of numbers, dates, invoices, payments. It looked like any other business ledger. "He's not stupid," Mara said. "It's clean." "No, he's not," Eli said, his eyes scanning the pages. He turned a page, then another. His fingers traced a line of entries. "But he's arrogant. He didn't think anyone would look this close." He pulled a folded, yellowed paper from his own coat pocket. It was an old railroad timetable, creased and soft as cloth. He spread it on the floor and pulled a nub of pencil from his waistcoat. "What are you doing?" "You said you copied the plats. You remember them?" "I dreamed them," she said. "Township 40 North, Range 62 West," he said, sketching a grid on the back of the timetable. The section with the burned-out fence line. Where was it? Section 4, the northwest quarter. She knelt beside him, her fear momentarily forgotten, replaced by the focus of the work. "No, the creek runs farther south. Like this." She took the pencil from his hand, her fingers brushing his. Her hand was small but firm. The lines she drew swift and certain. She corrected his sketch, her brow furrowed. "The original survey stake was here, by the cottonwoods. Vance's man claimed it was here, 100 yards east." Their hands grazed as she pointed, and the same jolt from the night before passed between them. A small, bright warmth that had nothing to do with the stove. It was the spark of 2 minds touching, of a shared understanding. This was a language they both spoke. He looked back at the ledger, at the invoice columns. Section 4, northwest quarter, 100 yards. He stared at the numbers. An invoice for post spikes and wire for $40.62. An entry for haulage for $4. "Mara," he said, his voice quiet, "look at these totals." She leaned closer, their shoulders touching. 40, 62, 4. He pointed to another entry. Invoice for grease and coal, $27.90. He looked at her. The claim near the salted well. Where was it? "Township 39 North, Range 61 East," she said, her voice catching. "Section 27. "Not 27 and 90, he murmured. "Township 39, Section 27. He ran his finger down the page. He's not logging invoice totals. He's logging mile references. Township and section numbers. He's using the ledger as a key. A private map of all the land he's stolen. He's hidden it right in his accounts." Mara stared at the page, her face pale. "I saw the numbers. I just thought I didn't see the code." "He never thought a surveyor would see this book," Eli said. He pulled more items from the trunk, a bundle of letters, tied with ribbon, from a telegraph operator who had written to Mara twice, scared, talking about held messages, and who had then vanished, and at the bottom, a small, heavy object wrapped in oilskin. Eli unwrapped it. It was a brass tag from a Gunter's survey chain.
"Vance's man dropped it," Mara said. "I found it near the creek on Section 4, long after he'd gone."
Eli turned it over in his palm. The identification number, which should have been stamped into the brass, had been filed off, the metal scarred and scratched.
"He filed the number off," Eli said.
"But he didn't file the chain. I'd wager my saddle that chain is a link or two short. 100 feet on his chain isn't 100 feet. It's just enough to make every section he measures overlap the one next to it. Just enough to steal a creek or a spring." They looked at each other, the full, ugly truth of it settling in the small room. She had the proof. She had the motive, the method, and the map.
"Vance's company has riders everywhere," she said, her voice hollow. "The sheriff in Dawson is on his payroll. The land registrar is a coward. Taking this to Cheyenne is suicide. They'll have us killed on the road and say it was horse thieves. This trunk, it's just paper. It's my word against his."
Eli stood up, his mind working. The surveyor's mind. He saw the problem, the terrain, and the objective. "No," he said. "It's not just your word. It's the word of the United States Cavalry." She looked at him, confused. "There's a telegraph post, a military line. It's about 40 miles north of here, at Fort McGinnis. It's just a small relay, but it's manned by a Signal Corps operator, a soldier. He won't be on Vance's payroll." He tapped the ledger. "We don't take the trunk. We take the copies. We take the tag. We ride hard. And we wire this, all of it, directly to the federal marshals in Cheyenne and to the War Department in Washington. Vance can stop a rider, but he can't stop the wire. Not a military wire." The color returned to her face, a flush of hope that was almost painful to see. 40 miles, in this snow. It's open range, cottonwood draws. We'll have to cross the Powder River braid, and it'll be frozen. It's hard, exposed country," he said, thinking it through. "But we can make it. If we leave now, that horse has had a night's rest. He can carry double for a few miles. Then we walk and ride. We'll be there by tomorrow night." The decision was made. The shack, which had been a refuge, was now a trap. They moved with a new, shared purpose. Eli went out to check the gelding's shoes, tapping them with a rock to make sure none were loose in the frozen hooves. The horse was weak, but it was a good bay, and it had grit. Mara went through the trunk, her hands no longer shaking. She selected the key ledger pages, the letters from the vanished operator, and the plats she had copied. She wrapped them in a square of oilskin, making a tight, waterproof bundle. She slung a small satchel over her shoulder with the last of the bread and pork, and a tin of coffee. She was pulling on her thin gloves when Eli came back in. He saw her fumbling with the wool scarf at her neck, her fingers stiff and clumsy. "Here," he said. He stepped in front of her, taking the scarf from her hands. He was close again, as close as he had been at the door. He looped the scarf around her neck, his movements gentle, practical. He tucked the ends into the collar of her coat. His fingers, rough and scarred, brushed the skin at the hollow of her throat. It was a small, accidental touch, but it stopped the air in her lungs. Her eyes met his. The gray of her gaze was no longer guarded. It was wide and deep. He saw the fear in them, but also the fight, and something else, a profound, aching vulnerability. She leaned in. It was not a conscious choice. It was a simple, animal instinct, like turning toward a fire. She leaned into his warmth, into his steadiness. Her face tilted up to his. It lasted only a heartbeat, one heartbeat too long. Then she caught herself. She pulled back, stepping away. Her cheeks suddenly colored a deep red that had nothing to do with the cold. The moment hung between them,
as sharp and fragile as an icicle. "We should go," she said softly, her voice husky. She turned and grabbed the rifle, not looking at him, and walked out the door. Eli grabbed his bedroll and saddlebags, reset the bench to bar the door from the inside, a futile gesture. He knew, and followed her into the blinding white. They set out under a sky that looked like a sheet of hammered tin. The wind had picked up again, a low, steady moan from the north. It lifted the fine, dry snow from the drifts, sending needles of it to cut at their faces. Eli led the gelding, with Mara walking behind him, holding the cantle of the saddle to help pull herself through the deep drifts. The world was endless white, the sun a pale wafer in the sky. After an hour, he stopped and helped her mount, then swung up behind her. The gelding grunted at the double weight but moved forward, its hooves punching deep, sucking holes in the snow. They rode in single file when the ground was windswept and bare. Eli walking to spare the horse, Mara riding, her back straight, the rifle across her lap. They did not speak. There was nothing to say that the wind did not say better. In the distance, a small herd of antelope, their coats the color of the winter grass, flashed their pale rumps and vanished like smoke, their breath plumed in the air, freezing instantly on Eli's mustache and Mara's scarf. Late in the afternoon, with the sun already sliding toward the black-toothed buttes in the west, they reached a grove of skeletal cottonwoods huddled in a draw. A frozen creek, barely a trickle of black ice, wound through the trees. "We'll camp here," Eli said. "The horse is done, and we'll be no good to anyone if we freeze to death tonight." Near the creek, he saw tracks, wolf tracks, large and fresh, interlaced with their own trail. They were being stalked, but not just by Vance's men. He found a place in the lee of a cut bank, a shallow overhang of frozen earth that offered minimal protection from the wind. It was the best they could do. He gathered deadfall from the cottonwoods, breaking the brittle, frozen branches, and with numb fingers, he coaxed a small, smoky fire to life. It was a pitiful thing, barely larger than his hat, but it was heat. Mara sat close, her knees drawn up, chafing her hands. The gray afternoon faded around them, the world shrinking to the small circle of their firelight. They ate the last of the bread, which was frozen solid, thawing it one bite at a time over the flames. Eli unrolled his bedroll, the heavy wool blanket, and spread it on the frozen ground. "We'll have to share," he said, his voice flat, practical. "It's the only way we'll keep from freezing." She nodded, not meeting his eyes. He sat first, his back against the cut bank. She sat beside him, close but not touching. He draped the heavy blanket over both of them, tucking it in around their shoulders. The shared space was intensely intimate, defined by the wool and their mutual need for survival. They sat in silence, watching the fire gutter. The cold was a living thing, pressing in from all sides. Mara's shoulder rested against his arm. He could feel the fine tremor running through her, the constant, exhausting shiver of her body fighting the cold. Then she turned to him. The firelight flickered in her eyes, catching the exhaustion and the fear. "Eli," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He looked at her, and she leaned in, quickly before either of them could think, and pressed her mouth to his. It was not the soft, hesitant lean-in from the shack. This was a clear, deliberate act. Her lips were cold, chapped, and tasted of winter and smoke. It was a quick, breathless kiss, over in an instant. There was no passion in it. It was something more desperate and more honest. She pulled back, her eyes searching his in the dim light. He saw no shame in them, only a stark, steady clarity. "I don't want to be alone in this," she whispered. It was not a plea for love. It was a plea for an ally. It was a confession that the weight of the ledgers, the fire, the dead child, and the men hunting her was too much to carry by herself. The kiss was a seal, a bargain made in the frozen dark. Eli didn't speak.
He just held her gaze, acknowledging the pact. He had been a man alone for a long time. Now, he was not. The night deepened. The cold became brutal. The fire died to a handful of red coals. From the darkness came the sounds of the plains, the sharp crack of the creek ice groaning and contracting, and later, faint but unmistakable, the distant sound of hooves on frozen earth. Someone was moving in the dark, far off, but moving. Mara stiffened, her head lifting. "They're looking," Eli murmured, his voice close to her ear. "They'll have missed us at the station. Now they're casting a net." He felt the tremor in her body increase, a vibration of pure fear. He acted without thinking. He shifted under the blanket, moving closer, not to claim her, but to guard her. He put his arm around her shoulders, pulling her against his side, offering his own body as a shield against the wind and the dark. He was larger, warmer, a solid mass of canvas and wool. She leaned into him, her head resting on his shoulder. He felt her take his hand, the one that was pinned between them, her cold fingers lacing with his. Their warmth began to build. It was a small, stubborn heat, contained by the wool blanket and their own sheer will. It was tender, and it was fierce. It was the heat of two living things pressed together, refusing to be frozen. They held there, breathing together, their breaths mingling in the frigid air, guarding a desire that was as bright and dangerous as a coal they refused to drop. Dawn broke gray and deadly. Eli was awake instantly, his senses screaming. The sound of hooves was gone, but the air felt wrong. He looked at Mara. She was already awake, her eyes wide, her hand still holding his. He shifted, slowly easing the blanket off, and he saw them. On the ridge crest to the east, silhouetted against the pale, sick light of morning, were two riders. They were not moving. They were just sitting on their horses, watching the draw, watching the thin, telltale wisp of smoke from their dead fire. "Vance's men." "Mara," Eli said, his voice low and urgent. "Get the satchel. Leave the bedroll. Move slow. Go to the horse." They broke camp in a terrible, cold silence. There was no time for fire, no time for coffee. Every movement was precise. Eli bridled the gelding, his fingers clumsy and numb, his eyes never leaving the ridge. Mara slung the oilskin satchel of papers across her body. The riders on the ridge saw them. One of them lifted an arm, pointing. "Now," Eli said. He threw Mara onto the saddle, and in one motion, he grabbed the horse's lead rope and the butt of his rifle. "Run! For the creek!" He didn't ride, he ran, pulling the horse, forcing the animal to break into a clumsy, slipping trot. The frozen braid of the Powder River was 100 yards away. It was their only chance. The trees would give them cover. A shot cracked the silence. The sound was flat and dead in the cold air. A puff of snow exploded 10 feet to their left. "Get down!" Eli yelled, pulling Mara half off the saddle, sheltering her with his own body as he ran. They reached the bank of the frozen creek. It was a braid, maybe 20 yards across, a sheet of black, uneven ice. "We have to lead him," Eli said, his breath tearing at his lungs. "We can't ride. The ice won't hold." He stepped onto the ice. It groaned, a long, tearing sound like a tree splitting. The horse balked, tossing its head, its eyes white with terror. Another shot cracked. This one was closer. The bullet sang past Eli's ear and struck a cottonwood branch above their heads, sending a shower of twigs and ice down. "Come on, boy," Eli roared. Yanking the lead, he slipped, his boot sliding, and went down to one knee. Mara was right behind him. She grabbed the horse's bridle. "Eli, go! I've got him!" He scrambled up, and together they pulled the panicked animal onto the groaning sheet. They were halfway across, every step a prayer, the ice flexing and cracking under the horse's weight. A third shot. This one was not aimed at them. It was aimed at the ice. The bullet struck the surface 3 feet in front of the horse, The black ice shattered. It didn't just crack, it exploded. A spider web of fissures shot out, and the main sheet in front of them gave way, plunging the horse's front legs into the black, rushing water below. The horse screamed, a sound of pure terror, as it thrashed, trying to find purchase. The ice was breaking all around them. "Let him go!" Eli shouted, grabbing Mara's arm and pulling her away from the horse. The gelding lunged, its powerful hindquarters heaving, and it found purchase on the far bank, dragging itself out, a mess of mud and ice and terror. Eli and Mara were just behind it, scrambling as the ice gave way completely. They plunged into the creek. The water was not deep, only to their knees, but the cold was shocking. A physical blow that stopped the heart. It was colder than the air, colder than death. They clawed their way up the muddy, frozen bank, soaked, shaking, gasping for air. The horse was standing 20 feet away, shivering violently. The riders were at the far bank now, pausing, unwilling to risk the crossing. One of them raised his rifle for a clearer shot. Get on," Eli yelled. He didn't bother with ceremony. He grabbed Mara by the waist and threw her bodily onto the gelding's saddle. He vaulted up behind her, grabbing the reins. He kicked the horse's ribs, and the animal, driven by pure fear, lunged forward into the trees, away from the creek, away from the men who were now firing, their bullets thudding harmlessly into the thick cottonwood trunks behind them. They were alive. They were soaked, and they were shaking, but they were alive. They rode north for 6 hours. The world was a frozen, ringing silence. Their clothes, soaked from the creek, had frozen solid. Eli's canvas coat cracked like a sheet of tin when he moved. Mara's skirts were stiff with ice, and her face was a pale, numb mask inside her scarf. The gelding, coated in rime, plodded on with the grim endurance of a creature that knew it was walking toward death. The riders had not followed them across the broken ice, but Eli knew they would not give up. They would be looping east, cutting them off from Dawson, assuming they would run back to the settlements. They were not running back. They were running north, into the empty. The telegraph post stood on a high, wind-scoured benchland. It was the loneliest outpost Eli had ever seen. A single small building, a tall pole with a limp, frozen flag, and a stovepipe breathing a thin, perfectly straight line of smoke into the bitter, still air. The lack of wind only made the cold more profound, a static, crushing weight. Eli slid from the horse's back, his legs buckled, his knees and thighs completely numb. He had to grab the saddle horn to keep from falling. Mara was little better. He reached up, and she fell into his arms, a rigid, frozen weight. He half carried her the 20 feet to the door. He kicked it with his boot, not having the strength to knock. The door flew open. A young man, barely 19, stood there, a revolver in his hand. He wore a blue wool uniform, the shirt unbuttoned at the collar. He had a pale face and a thin mustache that looked perpetually surprised. He stared at them. They must have been a sight, caked in ice and mud, faces raw, eyes hollowed out by exhaustion. "Mister," the young man started, his gun wavering. "Signal Corps," Eli said, his voice a raw croak. He pointed a frozen, gloved finger at the insignia on the man's sleeve. "We need the wire. Official business." The young operator, his eyes wide, stepped back to let them in. The room was blistering hot, the stove in the corner roaring. It smelled of hot metal, coffee, and the sharp, metallic tang of the telegraph battery. "My God," the operator said, staring at Mara. You'll freeze to death." "We're close," Eli grunted. He guided Mara to the stool by the stove. She collapsed onto it, her body beginning to shake violently as the heat hit her. The operator turned to her. "Ma'am, you're—" "Wait." He stopped. He squinted, his head tilting. "I know you." Mara looked up, her hood falling back. The young man flinched, It was not a big movement, just a quick, sharp intake of breath, a step back. But it was recognition, and it was fear. You're Mara Delaney, the woman from the Dawson fire. Mara's face, just beginning to thaw, hardened again.
I am.
The operator looked from her to Eli, and his hand moved instinctively toward the telegraph key, as if to sound an alarm. I'm not supposed to. The chief in Dawson said if you were seen. The chief in Dawson is a liar, Eli said, his voice cutting through the young man's panic. He stepped forward, into the light. He unbuttoned his frozen coat, the ice cracking and falling to the floor. He was not a drifter now. He was a man with a purpose, and his authority filled the small room. My name is Eli Carter. I was a surveyor for the Union Pacific for 6 years. I am requisitioning this line for government rate messages, effective immediately. The young operator, whose name Eli saw on a small sign, was Tom Avery, looked lost. Requisitioning. I don't have the authority. We are reporting federal land fraud, conspiracy to commit arson, and the suppression of a federal wire, Eli said, his voice like stones dropping on ice. You have the authority, and, son, if you refuse, you will be named as an accomplice. Tom Avery's face went pale. He was a boy, caught in a very large, very cold trap. Eli turned from him and went to Mara. She was fumbling with the oilskin packet, her fingers too numb to work the ties. Eli gently pushed her hands aside and untied the bundle. The papers were damp, but the oilskin had held. He spread the ledger pages, the copied plats, and the letters on Tom's small desk, next to the sounding key. I need to send 2 messages, Eli said to Tom. One to the U.S. Marshal's office in Cheyenne, the other to the General Land Office in Washington, D.C. He took the pencil from Tom's desk and a stack of blank message forms. He began to write, his hand steady despite the cold. He was not just writing a message. He was framing a case. He listed the township and range numbers, the section lines, and the dates of the fraudulent filings. He referenced the short chain. He named Silas Vance. Then he pushed the ledger book toward Tom. You're a telegrapher. You see codes every day. Look at these margins. Tom, swallowing, bent over the ledger. He stared at the columns of numbers that Eli had pointed out in the shack. 40 and 62, 27 and 90. His eyes widened. He looked at the plats Eli had spread out. He looked back at the ledger. His face changed. It was no longer fear. It was a dawning, sick understanding. Township 40, range 62, Tom whispered, his finger tracing the number. Section 27. I've seen this. I've seen these margins in the messages Vance sends. I always thought they were just account codes. They are, Eli said, a map of every acre he's stolen. Tom Avery sat down heavily on his stool. He looked at Mara, his gaze now filled with a terrible, young shame.
The fire,
he said, his voice barely audible.
The Dawson Depot fire. What about it?
Mara's voice was sharp. The stop order, Tom stammered. You said, rumor was you warned them about the wiring, that you told them the telegraph was drawing too much power.
I did,
Mara said. They said a stop order was sent to shut the line down for repairs, but it arrived too late. After the fire started, they said you knew the order was coming, and that's why you set the fire first, to hide your other work. That's the lie they told, Mara said, her voice flat. Tom looked at the desk. He looked at the key. He looked like he was going to be sick. It wasn't late, he whispered. The stop order, it never came at all. Eli and Mara froze. What? Eli said. It never came, Tom said, the words spilling out of him. A confession. Chief Hannigan, in Dawson. He got the warning from the regional office, the one about the faulty wiring.
He was supposed to send a stop order, shut the line down. But Vance was there. I heard them. Vance was expecting a big land grant confirmation. He told Hannigan that if that wire went dead, even for an hour, the grant would default. He said to let it ride. He'd take the risk. Tom looked at Mara, his eyes brimming. Hannigan. He told me to say the stop order was sent, but that the storm delayed it. He told me to lie. I was scared. I didn't want to lose my post.
The room was silent, save for the ticking of the regulator clock on the wall and the roar of the stove. Tom Avery had just given them the last piece, the piece that tied Vance not just to fraud, but to the fire, to the deaths. "You'll write that down," Eli said. It was not a request. Tom nodded, his whole body shaking. "I will. I'll write an affidavit. I'll sign it. What you're doing, Mr. It's right." For the next 2 hours, the small room was filled with the rhythmic, frantic clicking of the telegraph key. Tom sent the messages, his hand flying. He sent the affidavit. He sent the ledger codes. He sent the location of the short chain tag. He sent it all, twice, to 2 different cities, burning the truth into the wire. When he was done, he slumped back, pale and sweating. Though the room was cold now that the fire had been neglected, he carefully wrote out a receipt for the messages, a confirmation that they had been sent and received by the station in Cheyenne. He handed the small piece of paper to Mara. She took it, her hand, now steady, closing over it. It was the first official piece of paper she had held in a year that was not an accusation. "Ma'am," Tom said, not meeting her eye. I'm sorry. For the lie. For all of it. May God forgive me." It was not an apology. It was a prayer. "God forgive us all, Mr. Avery," Mara said quietly. "You're a brave man." "No, ma'am," he whispered. "I'm just a coward who finally got cornered. You'd best go. Vance will hear of this. When I don't answer the check-in from Dawson, Hannigan will know. He'll know." Eli nodded. He pulled on his coat, which was now just damp, not frozen. He helped Mara with hers. "You did a good thing, son. Bar the door after us and keep that revolver handy." They stepped back out into the cold. The sun was weaker, the light going flat. As they rode away from the lonely post, Eli looked back. The thin, straight line of smoke was still rising into the bitter air. They rode south, giving the creek a wide berth. They were no longer running from the riders. They were running from the wire. The news would travel faster than their horse. As the light began to fail, the wind returned. It did not come as a gale, but as a whisper. It rose from the ground, picking up the dry, powdered snow. Within 30 minutes, they were in a full-ground blizzard. It was not a storm from the sky. It was the plains themselves rising up. Snow like powdered glass whipped sideways, stinging their faces, scouring the air. Visibility dropped to 10 feet. The world vanished, replaced by a screaming, horizontal white. The horse stopped, refusing to walk into the blind, cutting spray. "We have to stop," Eli shouted over the wind. "We'll walk off a cut bank. We need shelter." He dismounted and pulled the horse, his head down, searching for any break in the terrain. He stumbled over something, a line of wood buried in the snow. A railroad tie. He followed it. A line shack, half buried in a drift, loomed out of the white. It was no bigger than a wagon box, just 4 boards and a tin roof. But it was shelter. He got the door open, a slab of rough wood on leather hinges, and shoved the horse inside with them. The shack was tiny. The world shrunk to a space 6 feet by 8. It smelled of old sweat, moldy oats, and dry cedar. In the corner, a pile of cedar branches had been left by a section crew. It was pitch black. Eli fumbled for a match and struck it. In the brief, flaring light, he saw Mara huddled against the wall, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking. The escape, the cold, the confession, the storm. It had all finally broken her. He lit a small fire in the rusted, broken stove. Using the dry cedar, the small space filled with the aromatic smoke and a faint, welcome heat, he found a half-empty sack of beans in a blackened pot. He melted snow and put the beans on to boil. They sat in silence for an hour. The blizzard shrieking outside, the fire popping. The world was nothing but the four walls and their shared breath. The tension from the telegraph post was still thick between them. Eli pulled the pot off the stove. He was clumsy with his frozen gloves, and the pot tilted. Half the beans in the precious hot water spilled onto the dirt floor. A ruined pot of beans, after everything. Eli stared at the mess, at the steaming mud, and he laughed. It was a raw, cracked sound, ripped from his exhausted lungs. He laughed until his empty stomach ached. After a second, Mara looked up. She saw the beans. She saw his face, cracked with cold and grime, and she started to laugh, too. It was not a sound of humor. It was the sound of a spring breaking, a hysterical, ragged, terrible sound of pure relief. They laughed until they were both breathless, until the tears freezing on their cheeks were real. The laughter subsided, leaving a different kind of quiet, a human quiet. "Your hands," Mara said, her voice hoarse. Eli looked down. He had taken his gloves off to work the pot. His hands were a mess. They were raw, the knuckles split and bleeding from the rains and the frozen log, the skin bright red and purple from the dunk in the creek. "They'll be fine," he said, flexing them. "No, they won't." She moved from the wall, kneeling in front of him. She took his hands in hers. Her own were cold, but they were soft. She held his large, rough hands, turning them over, inspecting the damage with a tenderness that made his throat tighten. "I have some salve," she whispered. She found a small tin in her satchel and began to gently, methodically, rub the grease into his raw skin. Her touch was light, but it was electric. She worked the salve into the cracks, her thumbs brushing his calluses. Her thumb passed over the old scar on his right knuckle, a puckered white line. "A fight?" she asked, her voice low. "A gear slip," he said. "On the survey, chain snapped back, nearly took the finger." She traced the scar, her touch lingering. The heat in the tiny shack was building. It was coming from the stove, but it was also coming from her hands, a heat that climbed his arms, settled in his chest, and made the air thick. He looked down at her bent head, the dark hair escaping its pins. He saw the pulse beating in her throat. He had seen this woman face down rifles, ride through blizzards, and unravel a conspiracy. Now he saw her, kneeling in the dirt, mending his wounds. She looked up. Her eyes met his. The gray was no longer guarded. It was deep, and it was clear, and it held the same heat he felt. He leaned down. She leaned up. This kiss was not the desperate, cold press in the draw. This was warm. It was slow. It was deep. It was the laughter, and the shared fear, and the coffee-laced smoke, and the relief of being alive, all in one. It was a kiss of profound, shaking hunger, a hunger for life, for warmth, for connection in a world that had offered nothing but ice. The storm outside was their witness, its roar a blanket over the sudden, sharp sound of their breathing. It went on, longer, deeper, until they were both clinging to each other, the small shack filled with a heat that had nothing to do with the cedar fire. They stopped. They pulled apart, both of them shaking. It was a tremor of pure restraint, and of a relief so deep it was painful. They were reckless, but they were not fools. They were survivors. "Eli," she whispered, her voice unsteady. "I know," he said, his own voice rough. He touched her cheek, his newly salved fingers brushing her skin. "We're alive, Mara. Let's stay that way." He moved to the other side of the fire, putting the small, glowing stove between them. They sat against opposite walls, the tension a living thing, A promise made, but not yet claimed. In the morning, the blizzard was gone. The world was scrubbed clean and silent. Eli stepped outside. The snow was drifted high, but the air was clear, and in the fresh snow, circling the shack, were tracks. Not horse tracks, wolf tracks. A large pack had circled them in the night, drawn by the scent of the horse and the people, kept at bay only by the tin roof and the wisp of smoke. "We're not the only things hunting on these plains," he said, stepping back inside. Mara was already packing. "Vance's men won't be far behind." They left before breakfast, saving the last of the beans. They did not take the open range. They cut south, dropping into the river breaks, a maze of winding gullies and frozen creek beds. It was slower, harder traveling, but it kept them off the skyline. The cottonwoods rattled their bare, bone-like branches. High above, a hawk cried, a thin, lonely sound. They were 2 hours from Dawson when Eli spotted him, a curl of smoke from a draw, so thin it was almost invisible. Eli dismounted, rifle in hand. "Stay with the horse." He moved on foot, slipping from rock to rock, silent as the shadows. In the draw, huddled by a fire of buffalo chips, was a man. He was old, with a wild, gray-white beard stained with tobacco, and a coat that was more patches than wool. A half-empty bottle of whiskey sat in the snow beside him, but his eyes, when he looked up and saw Eli, were bright and sharp. "Come on in, then," the old man rasped, his voice thick with a brogue. "I ain't got much, but the fire's free." He did not reach for the ancient Spencer rifle beside him. Eli lowered his own. "Morning. We're just passing through." "Aye," the old man said, taking a pull from the bottle. "That ye are, heading to Dawson." "I see. A bad town for honest folk." "You know it well?" Eli asked, motioning for Mara to come down. The old man's bright eyes flicked to Mara, then back to Eli. "I'm Seamus Doyle. I was a section hand for the UP. For 30 years, I built the line into Dawson, and I got tossed off it by the likes of Silas Vance." He spat into the fire. Eli's breath caught. He knelt by the fire. "You worked for Vance?" "I worked for the railroad. Vance was the landman, a shark in a gentleman's suit. I watched him. I watched him." "Seamus," Eli said, his voice low and urgent. "We need to know. The surveys. We've seen the plats. They're wrong. They overlap." Seamus let out a rattling cackle, his breath fogging, thick with whiskey. "Wrong? Aye, they're wrong. But they're wrong on purpose. I was there. I was the chain man for that crooked bastard he hired." "How?" Mara asked, stepping forward, her eyes fixed on the old man. "The chain, Gurley," Seamus said, tapping his temple. "The Gunter's chain, supposed to be 66 feet, 100 links. But Vance, he had a special one. He'd substitute it for the real one when the crew was out. This one, it was short, just a link, maybe 2. Just enough so that every 100 feet they measured was only 99. Over a mile, over a whole section. You're stealing acres at a time. You're moving the creeks. You're making parcels overlap. Just enough for a legal challenge. I told the foreman. He told me to shut my mouth or Vance would have me found in a blizzard. So I shut my mouth, and I took to the bottle." "Seamus," Mara said, her voice shaking. She pulled the oilskin packet out. "We have the ledgers. We have a wire from the cavalry post. We are taking this to the sheriff. Will you tell him what you just told us? Will you sign a statement?" The old man looked at the papers. He looked at Mara's desperate, honest face. He looked at Eli, a man he recognized as a fellow worker. He took another long drink. "That bastard Vance," he whispered. "He ruined this territory, and he cost me my job." He screwed the cap on the bottle. "Aye, I'll sign. It's the last decent thing I'll likely ever do." Eli wrote out the statement on the back of his timetable. Seamus, his hands shaking from whiskey and cold, took the pencil. He made a large, shaky X at the bottom.
There, he said. Seamus Doyle. His mark. Now get to town before his riders find ye. They've been scouring these breaks all morning.
They got to Dawson at 3 in the afternoon. As they rode up the main street, the big bell in the new white church began to toll. It was not for a service. It was slow, heavy, the sound of a funeral, the sound of judgment. People stopped on the boardwalks. They looked up from their wagons, and they saw her. The town went silent. A woman in a calico dress, who had been sweeping her porch, stopped, her eyes wide. She grabbed her small daughter by the arm and pulled the girl inside, slamming the door. 2 men talking outside the saloon stopped, their conversation dying. They turned their backs, just turned and faced the wall. Mara sat straight on the horse, her face pale, her eyes locked forward, looking at no one. As they passed the mercantile, a woman in a fine wool coat came out. She saw Mara, and her face twisted into a mask of pure, righteous hatred. She gathered herself and spat on the ground at Mara's feet. Mara flinched, as if struck. Eli stopped the horse. He looked at the woman until she flushed and hurried away. He put his hand on Mara's back, a small, steady pressure. We're almost there. The sheriff's office was at the end of the street. Sheriff Harlan Pike was standing outside. He was a tall man, made stooped by the weight of the badge he wore. He had a weary, cautious face, and he watched them approach with no welcome in his eyes. "Eli, ma'am," he said, his voice tired. He had heard. The wire from Cheyenne had reached him first. "Sheriff," Eli said, dismounting. He helped Mara down. She looked small and fragile in the face of the town's hatred. "We brought the proof," Eli said. He handed the sheriff the oilskin packet, the affidavit from Tom Avery, the mark of Seamus Doyle, the receipt from the U.S. Signal Corps. Sheriff Pike did not reach for them eagerly. He took the packet with just 2 fingers, as if it might burn him, as if it was a snake that might bite. "Vance is already in town," Pike said, his voice low, for their ears only. "He's got his lawyer with him, and a dozen riders at the saloon. He says those wires are lies, that you coerced that operator." "And you believe him?" Mara asked, her voice tight. Pike looked at the papers in his hand. He looked at the town. He looked at the saloon. "I believe that this is a whole hell of a lot of trouble. I'll have to hold a hearing. Tomorrow. But I can't guarantee your safety. Ma'am, Vance is stirring up the fire and brimstone crowd. They blame you for more than just the fire." "We need a room," Eli said. Pike shook his head. "The boarding house won't take her." Eli looked at Mara. Her last scrap of hope was fading. "I'll try," she said, and she walked, her head high, across the street to the boarding house. Eli and the sheriff watched. They saw her talk to the landlady, Mrs. Gable. They saw the woman shake her head, her arms crossed, pointing a finger at Mara. Mara turned, her back defeated, and walked back. "She said she won't have my kind, sleeping under her roof. She said it's not decent." Eli's jaw tightened. He looked at the livery stable. "Sheriff, what about the shed behind the livery, the one for tack?" Pike sighed. "It's cold, but it's empty. I'll tell the hostler. 10 cents. Eli paid the man. The shed was dark, drafty, and smelled of cold leather, manure, and straw. This was the welcome the town of Dawson offered. Eli brought in his own bedroll and spread it over a pile of clean straw in the corner. He lit his small lantern, and the single flame pushed back the worst of the gloom. That night, they ate cold salt pork. The whole town was alive with angry voices and the sound of men moving in groups. The saloon was loud. In the dark of the shed, they sat on the bedroll, their backs against the wall, listening. "My mother," Mara said, her voice very small in the dark. "She used to sing a lullaby about a riverboat. When I was scared, I can't remember how it ends." "My brother,"
Eli said, his voice just as quiet. Died of fever. In 68. I was supposed to be watching him. I went fishing. When I got back, the fever had taken his senses. He never knew me again.
They spoke of small, broken things, of the griefs they carried that had nothing to do with Silas Vance. They shared the histories that had scarred them, tracing the lines of their lives before they had converged in the storm. Their voices grew husky, thick with memory and exhaustion, and finally fell away into silence. The church bell tolled 10. The straw rustled.
Eli,
Mara's voice was a whisper. I'm here. That woman, the one who spit, the way they look at me. I'm not afraid of Vance, not really, or his men. I'm not even afraid of the fire. She took a shaky breath.
I'm afraid of that. I'm afraid it's going to swallow you, too, that one day you'll look at me, and that's all you'll be able to see. You'll see what they see.
He heard the deep, terrible fear beneath her words, the fear of being truly, finally, alone.
Eli said nothing. He didn't offer promises. Words were cheap. They were the wind. They were the lies Vance told.
Instead, he moved. He shifted on the straw, and he lay down beside her. He curled his body around her back, pulling the heavy wool blanket over both of them. He brought his arm around her, his hand resting on her waist. He was a solid, living wall of warmth. He rested his forehead against the back of her head, his breath warm against her hair. He just held her, saying nothing, holding through the long, creaking cold of the shed, as the angry sounds of the town faded and the wind began to rise. The courthouse was full by 9 in the morning. The air was thick and sour, smelling of wet wool, stale tobacco, and suspicion. Judge Hemphill, a man with a soft body and eyes that never quite met yours, sat high on the bench, a shield of polished oak between him and the town. Silas Vance had friends on that bench, but he had made enemies in the pews. The room was split. On one side sat the ranchers and merchants Vance had enriched. On the other, crammed onto benches and standing against the back wall, were the dryland farmers and small homesteaders he had squeezed, their faces grim, their hats held tight in their fists. At the doorway, a cluster of townswomen stood, arms crossed, their eyes hard and watchful. They were not there for the law. They were there for the judgment. Near them, the preacher, Reverend Thorne, murmured to a parishioner, his voice a low rumble, but Eli caught the words, wickedness in high places and in skirts. Mara, sitting beside Eli on the hard plaintiff's bench, heard it too. She did not look. She just placed her gloved hands flat on the table in front of her, her back straight as a surveyor's rod. The door opened, and Silas Vance entered. He was not a big man, but he filled the room. His boots were polished to a mirror shine, fresh from the bootblack, untouched by the town's muddy street. He was followed by a lawyer from Cheyenne, a man in a 3-piece suit carrying a heavy leather satchel. Vance scanned the room, his thin lips pulling into a smirk. He looked at Mara, his gaze lingering with a cold familiarity that made Eli's hand clench into a fist. Then he looked at Eli. The smirk faltered, just for an instant. He had expected the woman, alone and broken. He had not expected this quiet, steady man beside her. It was a fight he had not anticipated, but one he clearly still expected to win. He and his lawyer conferred with the judge, a quiet murmur of shared understanding. Then the lawyer, his voice a smooth, oiled baritone, presented Vance's case. It was a wall of paper, affidavits from men in Dawson, swearing to Mara's unsteady character, affidavits from his own surveyors, swearing to the accuracy of their chains. It was a neat, tidy package that smelled of fresh ink and expensive lies. Then it was Eli's turn. He did not speak. He simply stood. The defense calls Mr. Thomas Avery. Tom Avery walked to the bench. He was 19, pale, and shaking so hard the floorboards seemed to rattle. He looked at Vance, who smiled at him like a wolf. Tom flinched and looked away, his eyes finding Mara. She gave him a single, steady nod. He read his affidavit. His voice cracked on the first word but gained strength as he went. He told of the warning from the regional office. He told of Vance and Chief Hannigan. He told of the order to let it ride. And he told of the lie. The lie that the stop order had been sent but delayed. "It never came," Tom said, his voice ringing in the sudden, absolute silence. "He told me to say it did. He let it burn. For profit. He let them die." The affidavit landed on the judge's bench like a dropped horseshoe, a heavy, cold, unignorable piece of iron. "The defense calls Mr. Seamus Doyle," Eli said. Seamus shuffled forward, his patched coat reeking of whiskey, his eyes bright with a drinker's defiant clarity. The Cheyenne lawyer sneered, prepared to tear this old drunk apart. But Seamus didn't talk about motive or malice. He talked about math. "It was the chain," he said, his voice a gravelly rasp. "The Gunter's chain. I was his chain man. He'd bring out his special one for the new claims. It was short, 2 links short. Every time. 100 feet weren't 100 feet. It was 98, over a mile. That's a river. That's a pasture. That's a homestead." A low sound moved through the back of the room. This was not rumor. This was not a woman's hysteria. This was land. This was theft they could measure. The farmers looked at each other, their faces hardening. They had been cheated, not by law, but by a lie in the very links of a chain. Finally, Eli nodded to Mara. She stood. She did not speak of the fire. She did not speak of the child. She did not appeal for mercy. She simply laid out the ledger pages, the ones she had copied, the ones she had carried through the storm. Mr. Vance's ledger, June 3rd, she said, her voice low and clear. An invoice for axle grease for $22.50. She slid a copied plat beside it. The claim for the widow Matthias, Township 22, Range 50. He was logging his theft. She walked them through it, line by line, number by number. Her hands were steady on the papers. They trembled only once, when she unfolded the letter from the telegraph operator who had vanished. She paused, pressed her finger to the crease, and then continued, her voice as neat and cold as the columns of numbers. The room was suffocating. The evidence was too much. The Cheyenne lawyer was on his feet, objecting to hearsay and unprovenance. But the damage was done. Judge Hemphill looked at Vance. He looked at the angry faces of the farmers. He was trapped. He did what all trapped, weak men do. He stalled. "This is a great deal of complex testimony," he stammered, shuffling the papers. "Grave accusations. I will need time to consult the relevant statutes, to review these documents." He banged his gavel. "This hearing is adjourned. I will render my decision in 2 days." The room exploded. Men stood, shouting at the bench. Vance, cool as ice, gathered his papers and left through a side door, his lawyer clearing a path. The crowd spilled out onto the muddy street, frustrated, angry, and divided. Tom Avery, looking pale and sick, was pushed from the boardwalk by one of Vance's riders, a big man with a broken nose.
"Liar,"
the man snarled, shoving Tom again.
"You'll pay for that, boy."
Another rider joined him. Eli moved, stepping between them and Tom. "That's enough. The hearing's over." The first rider grinned. "Not for you, surveyor." He threw a punch. Eli turned with it, but the man was fast. The fist grazed his temple, and a heavy ring on the man's finger split Eli's cheek open. The coppery taste of blood filled his mouth. A fist fight bloomed, quick and mean, on the street. Eli was not a brawler. He was a surveyor, and he was outnumbered. He landed one hard punch to the first man's gut, but the second man hit him from the side, sending him stumbling. "Stop it!" It was Mara. She didn't scream. She stepped off the boardwalk,
right into the space between Eli and the two riders. She was a small woman, dwarfed by the men, but she stood as if she were made of iron. She looked the first rider in the eye. "He told the truth," she said, her voice steady as a plumb line, cutting through the shouts. "And you know it. Now get out of our way." The rider, his fist still cocked, stared at her. He had been prepared to beat a man. He was not prepared for this. He looked around, suddenly aware of the crowd watching, of the farmers who were now clenching their own fists. Sheriff Pike pushed through, his hand resting on the butt of his holster, not with menace, but with a deep weariness. "That's done. All of you, break it up. Go on, go home. It's over." The riders, sullen and cursing, backed away, melting into the crowd. Eli spat blood onto the mud. Mara was at his side, her hand on his arm, her knuckles white. "You're bleeding," she said. "He's uglier," Eli replied, wiping his cheek. The cut was deep. They walked back to the livery shed in silence, the town's eyes on their backs, a new and dangerous energy in the air. That night, the bell tolled again, but this time, it was not the slow toll of judgment. It was the frantic, panicked ringing of the fire alarm. Eli threw open the shed door. The sky to the east was not black. It was a hellish, pulsing orange. "Fire!" a man shouted, running past the livery. "The new grain warehouse! It's going up!" Eli and Mara ran into the street. The warehouse, the largest building in town, was a torch, flames shredding the night sky, sparks raining down on the roofs nearby. The whole town was running toward it, men hauling buckets, women screaming. Then, a new shout, high and sharp, from the alley near the burning building. It was one of Vance's men. "It's her! I saw her! I saw the woman! The firebug! She was in the alley!" The crowd stopped. The men with buckets, the running women. They all stopped. They turned, a single, mindless creature, its many eyes fixing on Mara, who stood frozen in the street, the orange firelight painting her face. "She did it again," a woman shrieked. "She burned the depot, and now she's burning the town. Lynch her!" a man roared from the back. The mob turned. It was not a group of people. It was a flock, a single entity, and it began to move. Mara's instinct was to run, to flee as she had always done. She took a step back, her face a mask of old, familiar terror. But Eli was there. He grabbed her hand. "Not this time." He didn't run toward the edge of town. He ran into the dark. He pulled her off the main street and into the narrow, black alley between the mercantile and the assayer's office. The town's roar was at their backs, the sound of boots on the boardwalk, men shouting her name. He pulled her through a broken fence, across a backyard, and into another alley. He was moving toward the one place no one would think to look, the schoolhouse. He tried the door, locked. He didn't hesitate. He used his boot, kicking the wood just beside the knob. The cheap lock splintered, and the door flew open. He pushed her inside and followed, barring the door with the teacher's heavy oaken chair. They stood in the pitch dark, panting, their chests heaving. The roar of the mob was muffled now, a beast baying in the distance. The only sound in the room was their own ragged breathing and the thud of their hearts. The room smelled of chalk dust, old paper, and the sharp, acidic tang of ink from the bottles on the desks. "Eli, Eli, oh God." Mara was shaking, her whole body vibrating, her teeth chattering, not from cold, but from pure, animal terror. "We're safe. For now," he said, his voice rough. "They won't look here. They think you're running for the plains." He fumbled in his pocket and struck a match. The small flame flared. On the teacher's desk was a lamp. He lit the wick, and a small, steady, golden light pushed back the shadows. It illuminated the children's small desks, the alphabet painted on a board on the wall, and the globe of the world on its stand. He turned to Mara. She was pressed against the wall,
her eyes wide and black in the lamplight. The shaking was violent now, a tremor she could not control. He moved to her. He didn't speak. He put his hands on her arms, just holding her, trying to lend his steadiness to her.
"They want to kill me,"
she whispered, the words rattling in her throat.
"They really want to kill me."
"I won't let them," he said. The fear was too big. It had to go somewhere. It spilled over, turning into a fierce, desperate tenderness. He pulled her away from the wall, and his mouth found hers. It was not the slow, heated kiss from the line shack. This was a collision. It was desperate, fueled by adrenaline and the roar of the mob. It was a kiss that tasted of his blood and her fear. It was a raw, aching confirmation of life in the face of the fire and the hate. They clung to each other, their bodies pressed together. He backed her against the teacher's heavy desk, his hands in her hair, pulling the pins loose, her hands fisted in his shirt. They kissed until the shaking eased, until the chattering of her teeth stopped, until their breath, sharp and ragged, began to cross, mingling in the quiet room. It was a long time before they stopped. They did not rush. They let the wanting, born of terror, steady into a deep, aching trust. They were two people, aligned, their bodies speaking a language of patience, of survival. He rested his forehead against hers, their breath still mingling. The silence of the schoolhouse was profound. In that quiet, in that small circle of lamplight, she told him the deepest truth. It wasn't just a child in the Dawson fire. Eli, her voice was a raw, broken whisper, directed at his chest. He was my boy, Jacob. He was 4 years old. Eli went still. His arms, which had been holding her with passion, now held her with a new, terrible reverence.
"I was lodging at the depot,"
she continued, her voice hollow, the words falling into the dark. "My husband, he died of pneumonia the year before. Jacob was all I had. When the fire started, it came up so fast. The smoke it was so thick. I had him in my arms, in the hallway. But the smoke, I couldn't see. I fell." She was not crying. She was beyond tears. She was in the cold, dead center of her grief. "When the men pulled me out, I didn't have him. He wasn't in my arms. They said he died of the smoke, that he never even felt the flames, just went to sleep." She took a shuddering breath and finally looked at him, her eyes a storm of guilt. "The town blames me for the fire, but I blame me for letting go, for not holding on tight enough, for failing him, because no one believed my warning, because a man wanted to protect his profit on a land grant. My boy died because of a stop order that never came." She had carried it all, alone. The town's blame for the fire, and her own, secret blame for the death of her son. Eli Carter had no words. There were no words for this. Promises were wind. Apologies were useless. So his answer was simple. He said nothing. He just moved one of his hands from her waist to the back of her head, his fingers tangling in her loosened hair. He pulled her head gently to his, resting his forehead against hers. His eyes closed. He held her, breathing in the scent of her, the chalk dust and the old, bottomless grief. He just stood there, holding her, sharing the impossible weight in silence, until the first gray light of dawn began to creep through the windows, and he felt the terrible, rigid tension in her body finally begin to soften. The kick on the door made them jump apart. "Mara! Carter! Open this door! This is the sheriff!" Eli moved, his body instantly shielding Mara. He unbarred the door. Sheriff Harlan Pike stood there, his face gray with exhaustion. He wasn't looking at them as lovers caught in shame. He looked at them like witnesses he had been protecting. He looked past them, saw the lamplight, the unmade desk, and his gaze softened with something like pity, not disgust. "You're safe," he said, his voice flat. The mob's dispersed. The warehouse is gone. He rubbed his face, his hand rough on his beard. I've been up all night, not chasing you. I've been working. What did you find? Eli asked. The fire didn't start where they said, Pike said, stepping into the room. It didn't start in the office. It started at the back, by the loading dock, at the tar barrel. Someone doused the wall with tar and lit it. He looked at Eli. And I found this. He held up a muddy, half-burned boot. No, I found the print, clear as day, in the mud by the barrel. This boot. I took it off the foot of one of Vance's riders not an hour ago. A man named Calloway. He was drunk, asleep in the saloon, with this boot tucked under his cot. It matches. Perfect. The sheriff let out a long, tired breath. I'm a weary man, Carter. I try to keep the peace, but I am tired of being made a fool. Vance, he burned a building in my town, just to hang a woman he'd already ruined. He's gone too far. So you'll arrest him? Mara asked, her voice thin. Pike shook his head. The judge is still an arson charge won't stick. Not with Calloway denying it and Vance's lawyer screaming. It's one boot print against all that money. He looked at the papers Eli was gathering from the desk. The ledger copies. No, the law in that courthouse is broken. We need to take it to the people. What do you mean? Eli asked. I mean a public meeting, not a hearing, a reckoning. Pike looked at his boots. The livery, it's the only place big enough to hold everyone. And it's neutral ground, with my uneasy help. We'll call a meeting for this afternoon. The word went out. The noon whistle, which usually called men to dinner, blew a long, sustained blast. The church bell, which had tolled for fire and judgment, began to ring, slow and steady. A dinner bell. People came, drawn by the sound. They came from the mercantile, the saloon, the homesteads. They came to see blood, or to finally hear the truth. The livery began to fill, the air thick with the smell of hay, manure, and nervous sweat. Eli, Mara, and Tom Avery were in the sheriff's office, waiting. Seamus was there too, sober for once, his hands shaking. It's time, Pike said. They walked out. As they crossed the street, Tom Avery slowed, his gaze fixed on the alley beside the livery. Two men were standing there, in the shadows. Calloway, the man with the boot print, and the other rider who had started the fight. They were not watching the crowd. They were watching Tom. I can't, Tom whispered, his courage gone. They'll kill me. Vance was trying to stop his witness. Mara, get Tom and Seamus to the livery, Eli said, his voice low and cold. Get them inside. Go the long way around. Eli, what are you doing? Go, now. She saw the look on his face. She grabbed Tom's arm and Seamus's, and she pulled them away. Eli turned and walked into the alley. The two riders watched him, surprised. Calloway smirked. Lost your way, surveyor? This ain't your business. You're not stopping him, Eli said. That's what you think? Calloway stepped forward. He pulled a skinning knife from his belt. The other man just cracked his knuckles. This was not a fight in the street, with a crowd and a sheriff. This was a fight in an alley, over frozen mud, between the livery and the smithy. Calloway lunged with the knife. Eli was a surveyor. He knew angles. He didn't meet the attack. He sidestepped, grabbing the man's wrist, and used his weight, driving the man's arm, knife and all, hard against the brick wall of the smithy. The man screamed as the knife clattered to the ground. Eli didn't stop. He hit the man twice, hard, in the kidneys. The second man came at him, swinging. Eli ducked the punch and drove his shoulder into the man's stomach. They both went down, crashing into a pile of empty barrels. They rolled on the frozen, muddy ground. It was all knuckles and boots. The man was stronger, but Eli was colder. He was fighting for Mara. He was fighting for Jacob. He got his boot free and kicked the man in the ribs, a short, vicious, practical motion. The man wheezed, the air driven from him. Eli got to his feet. He was covered in mud, his cheek bleeding again. Calloway was holding his broken wrist, moaning. The other man was trying to get his breath back. It was not pretty, but it was enough. Eli walked out of the alley, wiping the mud and blood from his mouth. He walked into the livery. The great barn was packed, the crowd silent and waiting. Tom Avery, pale but standing, watched him walk in. Mara was at his elbow, her hand on his arm, not as a woman needing protection, but as a brother would stand, offering strength. Tom saw Eli, and he stood up straighter. It was time. The livery was a tinderbox of humanity. It stank of old manure, dry hay, and the sour, close smell of nervous sweat. High in the rafters, the warm breath of 24 horses clouded in the cold air. Men packed the floor, shoulder to shoulder, their expressions ranging from sullen to curious to outright angry. They were miners, farmers, merchants, and saloon hands, a jury of the entire town. The hayloft above was lined with women, their faces shadowed, looking down on the proceedings. Even children were there, their small faces peering through the slats of the empty stalls. This was not a court of law. It was a court of survival. Sheriff Harlan Pike stood at the great double doors, his back to the street. He did not watch the crowd. He watched the alley, his hand resting, not gripping, on the butt of his holstered pistol. He had created this moment, and now he had to contain it. In the center, on a clear patch of straw-covered ground, stood a small table. Eli, Mara, Tom Avery, and Seamus Doyle stood on one side. On the other, Silas Vance and his Cheyenne lawyer stood alone. Vance's riders were in the crowd, scattered, their faces dark. "This is not a legal hearing," Pike announced, his voice booming in the enclosed space. "The judge has deferred. This is a public meeting. These people have made claims. You've all heard the rumors. Now you will hear the testimony, and you will judge for yourselves." He nodded to Eli. Eli nodded to Tom. Tom Avery stepped forward. He was still pale, but the shaking in his hands had stopped. He faced the crowd. "My name is Tom Avery," he said, his voice high but clear. "I am, or I was, the operator for the Signal Corps at Fort McGinnis. Before that, I was a relief operator in Dawson." He took a deep breath. "You all know the story of the fire. You were told a stop order was sent to shut the line down for faulty wiring. You were told it came too late. You were told that was motive." He glanced at Mara, who watched him, her face impassive. "That was a lie," Tom said. The crowd murmured. "A stop order was never sent. Chief Hannigan in Dawson received the warning, but Mr. Vance," he pointed a shaking finger at Silas Vance. "Mr. Vance told him to let it ride. To ignore the warning. He had a land grant coming through, and he wouldn't let a small risk kill the deal." Vance's lawyer shouted, "Objection! This is slander. The boy is a known associate of the accused." "There are no objections here." Pike's voice cut through. "Only testimony. Let him speak." "He told me to say the order was sent," Tom continued, his voice gaining strength. "He made me lie, a lie that cost 3 lives. I have sent a sworn affidavit to the U.S. Marshals, and I'm saying it to you now. He let it burn." Tom stepped back. His part done, the crowd was a low, angry hum. Seamus Doyle shuffled forward. He was drunk, but he was a lucid, angry drunk. He held something up. It was a length of heavy iron chain. "You all know me," he slurred, his bright eyes scanning the farmers. "I'm Seamus, a drunk, but I was a chain man first. I carried the links that measured this whole territory." He held up the chain, and with his other hand, he pointed to one link, a link that had been filed and repaired, slightly shorter than the others. "This," he said, "is a lie. This is Mr.
Vance's special chain. I was there. He'd swap it in. It's short. Just one link filed down. Maybe another. You measure 100 feet. You're only measuring 98. You measure a mile. You're stealing. The murmur from the farmers grew louder. This was a language they understood. They had walked those fence lines. They had wondered why the creek was on their neighbor's land.
That ain't fraud. That's just theft. Plain and simple,
a man shouted from the back. Seamus nodded and stepped back. Then Eli stepped forward. He unrolled a large, yellowed piece of paper on the table. It was a county plat map, one he'd gotten from the sheriff's office. "My name is Eli Carter," he said, his voice even and calm, the voice of a man who deals in facts. "I was a surveyor. I know this map, and I know the marks Seamus is talking about." He took a piece of charcoal from his pocket. "Look here, Township 40, Range 62. This is Jed Miller's claim. And this," he drew a second, slightly overlapping line, "is the railroad grant Vance filed 2 months later. According to this map, they overlap. The law says the first filing holds, but the second filing was made with a short chain. It made Jed's property look smaller than it was. It put his spring on Vance's land. Jed had to sell. He sold for pennies." He moved his finger. "And here, Township 39, Range 61, the widow Matthias. Her husband died building the spur line. Her claim was here. Vance's claim, filed with the short chain, moved the line, just enough to take her well." An angry tide was building. Murmurs of, "I knew it," and "He did the same to me," and "That thief" rose from the crowd. Eli's finger moved across the map, from parcel to parcel, township to range, connecting the dots of Vance's greed, turning rumor into a landscape of theft. He held up the ledger, and here, in his own book, he kept a code, 40 and 62, 39 and 61. He kept a record of every family he broke. He stepped back. The livery was a low, angry roar. Mara's voice came last. She stepped forward, and the room, incredibly, fell silent. She was the one they had come to judge. She was the firebug, the harlot. Her voice was low, but it carried to the rafters. It was clear as winter water. "I am not here to ask for your pity," she said, her hands clasped in front of her. "I am only here to ask you to listen." She did not talk about maps. She did not talk about chains. She talked about people. On June 3rd, 1887, Mr. Vance foreclosed on the widow Matthias. The woman, Mr. Carter just showed you, her well had gone dry because his new fence line had claimed it. She sold her land for $10. She looked at the women in the loft. On August 14th, he filed against the estate of Sarah Goodnight. Her husband had fallen from a trestle. Mr. Vance's survey showed her house was on company land. She lives in a tent outside Cheyenne with her 3 children. She named the dates. She named the sums. She named the widows, one by one. She did not raise her voice. She did not cry. She laid the facts out, neat as fence posts, one after another. "They say I set the fire in Dawson," she continued, her voice dropping, and the room stilled to a breathless hush. Even the horses seemed to stop shifting in their stalls. "You have heard Mr. Avery. Mr. Vance let that fire burn. He let it burn to protect a land deal, to protect his profit." She paused, and her hands, which had been steady, finally clenched. 2 men died in that fire. Good men, section hands, but they were not the only ones. She took a breath, and when she spoke again, her voice was raw with a grief so profound it was almost silent. "My son was with me. His name was Jacob. He was 4 years old. He was lost. He died of the smoke, because a stop order was delayed, because Mr. Vance's profit was more important than a faulty wire, more important than my boy." The silence was absolute. It was a vacuum. It was broken by a single soft snort from a horse in a nearby stall.
a sound so normal it was shocking. The women in the loft were leaning forward, their faces no longer hard, but stricken. The preacher, Thorne, looked down at his own hands as if seeing them for the first time. Silas Vance, who had been watching this all with a cold, amused detachment, knew he had lost. The tide had turned, not with law, but with a mother's grief. He tried to laugh it off, a short, barking sound.
This is preposterous. A drunk, a lovesick boy, and a hysterical woman. You have no proof of any of this. My lawyer—"
His lawyer from Cheyenne rose, his face pale. He looked at the angry faces of the farmers. He looked at the weeping women in the loft. He looked at the hard, steady gaze of Eli Carter. He opened his mouth, then closed it. He sat back down, his case wilting under the weight of the numbers, the chain, and the unbearable truth. "But I have proof, Mr. Vance." Sheriff Pike's voice was cold. He stepped forward from the door. He was holding the muddy, half-burned boot, Calloway's boot. "I have proof of last night." He held the boot up. "This belongs to one of your men. I found the print it made, in the mud and tar behind the warehouse, right where the fire started. A fire set to silence this woman for good." He looked into the crowd. "And I have a witness, Mr. Abernathy, who was sleeping in the smithy, saw Mr. Vance's man, Calloway, running from the barrel not 2 minutes before the alarm." A smith, his face black with soot, nodded from the crowd. "I saw him." It was over. The accusations of fraud were one thing, but this was arson. In their town, last night, the murmurs exploded into a roar. "Thief! Burner! Murderer!" Cornered, Vance's civilized mask tore away. He was not a businessman. He was a rat in a trap. He moved. He did not run for the door. He lunged at Mara. He was not going down alone. He pulled a small, silver-plated derringer from his waistcoat pocket. A gun flashed dull in the lamplight. "Mara!" Eli shouted. Eli moved without thinking. He threw himself in front of her, shoving her back. The shot cracked. The sound was deafening in the enclosed barn. Eli felt no pain. He just felt a kick, a solid, violent impact, like a mule kick, high in his left shoulder. It spun him around. He stumbled, his legs gone weak. He looked down. A dark, wet stain was spreading with shocking speed across his shirt. Blood, warm and sudden, ran down his side. He heard Mara's cry. It was not a scream. It was a raw, wordless sound of animal grief, the sound he had heard in his dreams of her. The livery exploded into chaos. Men piled onto Vance, a wave of bodies driving him down into the straw and manure. He was punching, kicking, but he was overwhelmed. Eli saw the Cheyenne lawyer slip out the back door, a ghost vanishing. Then the world tilted. Eli's knees buckled, and he went down, his back hitting the wall of a stall. The chaos settled as quickly as it had begun. It focused into swift, practical action. "He's got him! Get his hands!" Sheriff Pike pushed through, his gun finally in his hand. "Don't kill him! Hold him!" 2 ranchers, the same men who had been shouting about their land, were already binding Vance's wrists with a length of rope from a stall. Vance was spitting, his face a mask of hate, but he was finished. "Get the doctor!" Pike yelled. "Doc Miller, get over here!" The town doctor, a small man with glasses, pushed through the crowd, his black bag in his hand. He knelt beside Eli, who was leaning against the wall, his face pale, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. "Let me see," the doctor said, his voice calm as he ripped Eli's shirt open. "Well, hell. You're lucky, son. Went clean through, high on the shoulder, missed the lung, missed the bone. It's through and through." "Mara," Eli managed to say, trying to look for her. She was already there. She knelt in the straw beside him. her face paper white, but her hands were steady. The doctor was pressing rags to the entry wound, and Mara was already at Eli's back, pressing another wad of clean cloth to the exit.
"I've got him, doctor,"
she said, her voice shaking but firm. "Hold that pressure," the doctor ordered.
"You, get me my kit from the buggy."
The crowd parted, giving them air. Mara knelt, her body pressed against Eli's as she held the bandage tight, her eyes locked on his, refusing to be pushed away, refusing to let him go. The news flowed along the wire that Tom Avery now commanded. The lies were replaced by the truth. Charges were lodged in Cheyenne, not by the local judge, but by the federal marshal, based on Tom's affidavit and the corroborating testimony of the entire town. Fraud, arson, tampering with federal property, conspiracy. Judge Hemphill, smelling a tide he could not possibly turn, and likely fearing for his own position, swiftly signed every warrant Sheriff Pike put in front of him. Vance was formally arrested and held in the town's small stone jail, no longer as a courtesy, but as a federal prisoner, held for transport to Cheyenne. That night, the snow began to fall again. They were back in the boarding house shed. The landlady, her face pale and ashamed after the meeting, had offered Mara a room. Mara had refused. She had asked only for a clean blanket and a bucket of hot water. Eli was lying on the bedroll, his bandage fresh and white. The shed was cold, but the small lantern cast a warm, intimate glow. Mara sat beside him, carefully wiping the last of the dried blood and grime from his good hand with a damp cloth. His fear had been simple. He had been afraid of the gun, but now, in the aftermath, a deeper, colder fear was setting in. The fear of what came next, the fear of the quiet. Mara felt it in the tension of his hand. Her tenderness was careful, intimate as breath. She undressed his fear with soft words, her voice a low murmur in the quiet shed.
"It's over, Eli,"
she whispered. "You're safe. We're safe." She leaned down and kissed his temple, her lips soft against his skin. She took his good hand, her fingers lacing with his, holding him steady. The tremors, the last of the adrenaline from the fight and the shot, began to ease. Desire hummed between them, low and full. It was not the desperate, frantic blaze of the schoolhouse. It was not the cold, defiant spark in the draw. It was an anchoring. It was the deep, steady warmth of a fire that has burned down to its coals, a heat that will last the whole night. Outside, the snow fell thick and silent. It muffled the sounds of the town, of the world. It was as if they were the only two people left, cocooned in the small shed, in the smell of straw and clean linen.
"I used to hate the snow,"
Mara said quietly, her head resting on the edge of the cot, near his hand. It was the sound of being alone, of being buried. "And now?" he asked, his voice rough. "Now, it just sounds quiet." They spoke of small futures, the kind of futures people who have almost died allow themselves. "The stove in that shack," she said, a small smile in her voice. "It never drew well. The pipe is angled wrong." "It needs another elbow joint," Eli murmured, his eyes closed. "And a new damper. I could fix that." "It needs shelves, too," she said, "for ledgers and beans, and a bell, a proper bell, on a spring, over the door, so I can hear when a customer comes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You kept the keys to the station." He felt her smile against his hand.
"I did. I kept the keys."
"That's good," Eli said, his voice thick with weariness and laudanum from the doctor. "Because I know how to hang a door, how to hang one true, so it opens without a sound and closes tight against the wind." She laced her fingers tighter with his. They said nothing else. They just held on, as the snow fell, burying the town in silence and clean, fresh white. At dawn, 2 federal marshals arrived. They came in a heavy sleigh, the horses steaming in the cold, They went to the jail. Vance was brought out, bound in chains. He was sullen, his fine suit rumpled and stained with straw. He looked at the town, at the people who had come out to watch him go. He saw the preacher, Reverend Thorne, standing on the steps of the church, his arms crossed. Vance gathered himself and spat, once, into the clean snow. Nobody laughed, nobody jeered. The town just watched in silence. The preacher bowed his head. He said nothing at all. The sleigh moved out, its bells a sharp, clear sound in the new morning, and headed east, toward Cheyenne. The snows melted, not in a gentle thaw, but in a rush, turning the draws into muddy torrents. The high plains, scoured and frozen for so long, exhaled. A pale, hesitant green laid itself along the creek bottoms. On the cottonwoods, tight, sticky buds began to pop, a promise of shade to come. The abandoned station, which had been their fortress, became their work. It woke under their hands. Mara, with a bucket of lye, vinegar, and hot water, scrubbed the years of smoke and grime from the windows. The glass, thin and warped, let in a new, clean light. Eli, his left shoulder still stiff, worked with the deliberate, patient movements of a man who understood wood. He took the warped sill from the front door, planing it smooth until it was true again. He rehung the door, just as he had promised, with the new leather hinges. It no longer scraped the floor. It closed with a solid, satisfying sound that shut the wind out completely. His biggest project was the semaphore arm. He spent 2 days climbing the rickety tower, his arm aching, oiling the frozen gears, splicing the rotted rope with new cable. On the evening of the second day, he stood on the platform and pulled the heavy iron lever. With a high, metallic groan, the semaphore arm, which had been tilted at a drunken angle of failure, rose high against the blue dusk. It stood straight and tall, a salute to the coming night. Dawson remained a town split by a scar. The healing was not clean. When Mara rode in on the gelding, now healthy and strong, for flour and salt, she was still a spectacle. Some women, like Mrs. Gable, the boarding house landlady, would still cross the muddy street, pulling their children close, their faces set in the old, hard lines of judgment. The whispers did not die, but they grew quieter. Others, however, had changed. Mrs. Miller, the woman whose husband Jed's land had been the first on Eli's map, stopped Mara outside the mercantile. She was a thin woman, worn down by wind and worry. She did not speak. She just looked at Mara, her eyes red, and pressed a small loaf of fresh-baked bread into her hands. The apology was in the warmth of the loaf. Mara took it, her throat tight, and nodded. Sheriff Harlan Pike rode out to the station one afternoon. He found Eli measuring the back wall for shelves and Mara sorting invoices. He dismounted and took off his hat, holding it in both hands. "Ma'am, Carter," he said, his eyes on the newly mended door. "This place looks solid." "It's getting there," Eli said. Pike shuffled his feet. I came to say, a man in my position, he watches the currents. He tries to keep his footing, not get swept away. I saw the current. I knew which way it was running, and I stood still for too long." He finally looked at Mara, his gaze direct and ashamed. I was late to courage, and I'm sorry for it." Mara stopped her work and looked at the weary man. He had come when it mattered. He had stood with them in the livery. "You did the right thing, Sheriff," she said quietly. "Thank you." He nodded, relieved. "The town owes you. What you did, well, it's made a lot of men look at their own maps. Good day." He put his hat on and rode away, his back a little straighter. A week later, the afternoon stage, which now ran twice a week, stopped at the way stop. The driver handed Mara a thick envelope from the territorial office in Cheyenne. It was addressed to M. Delaney and E. Carter, proprietors. Dawson Spur Way Stop. Eli came in, wiping grease from his hands, and read it over her shoulder. The language was dry, official, and beautiful. The federal investigation, sparked by the wires from Fort McGinnis, was complete. The fraud was confirmed. Vance's land grant scheme was ruled null and void. All parcels, including those of the Miller family and the widows Mara had named, were to be restored to their original owners or their estates. Fines, heavy ones, were levied against Vance's frozen assets to pay for the damages. The letter mentioned the others. Operator Thomas Avery had been commended for brave and dutiful service to the Signal Corps and was being reassigned to a larger, more important post in Laramie. He was safe. A territorial bank draft was included, payable to Mr. Seamus Doyle, for 5 years of back pay owed by the railroad. "He'll drink himself to death inside a month," Eli said, a small smile touching his lips.
"It's a good death, for Seamus,"
Mara replied, her own smile faint.
"It's the one he wanted."
The last line was clipped. "By order of the governor, Judge Martin Hemphill has been officially retired from the bench." They stood on the platform, the letter in Mara's hand, the prairie wind flapping the paper. It was done. It was victory. But it felt thin. The relief was real, but there was no celebration. The ink on the page was dry, and it could not bring back the dead. Spring was wet that year. Thunderstorms built over the buttes, great purple anvils that crackled with lightning. The air would grow heavy, tasting of ozone and wet dust. On those damp days, Eli's shoulder ached. The wound had closed, leaving a puckered, angry scar on his shoulder and a smaller one on his back. But the muscles beneath were knotted and stiff. He would stand at the newly cleaned window, watching the rain, his right hand rubbing the joint, his jaw tight. One afternoon, as the sky darkened and the first rumbles of thunder rolled across the plains, Mara came up behind him. He was trying to lift his arm, stretching it, and he winced, his breath hissing.
"It's tight,"
he said, frustrated.
"Let me,"
she said. Her voice was low. He stopped, surprised. She stood behind him, close, and put her hands on the scarred muscle. Her hands were warm, her palms calloused from scrubbing and work. But her touch was sure. She began to knead the tight, ropey muscle, her thumbs pressing deep. He grunted, the pain sharp, but it was a pain that unlocked something. "Raise your arm," she commanded softly. Slowly, he lifted his arm, bracing his good hand on the windowsill. She guided the movement, her other hand on his back, her fingers tracing the path of the bullet.
"Again,"
she whispered. He raised it again, higher this time, the scar pulling. She pressed her cheek against his back, her hair brushing his skin, feeling the tension in him, her hands gentle but relentlessly firm. Again. This was the intimacy they had forged. It was deeper than the fierce, hungry kisses in the line shack, deeper than the desperate comfort in the schoolhouse. That had been born of fear and adrenaline, a need to prove they were alive. This was the intimacy of care. This was the quiet language of mending. She knew the shape of his wound. She knew the limits of his pain. A different kind of heat came from it. It was not the blaze of survival, but the slow, sure heat of a banked fire, kindled by trust. It had been built plank by plank, word by word, day by day. He turned in her hands, his shoulder forgotten, his arm still raised. He looked at her steady, gray eyes, at the woman who had held the bandage to his back while he bled in the straw. He lowered his arm and cupped her face. They kissed, and the kiss was like the storm outside, slow to build and electric with power. They made love that afternoon, on the narrow cot in the back room, while the thunder rattled the window panes and the rain lashed the new roof. It was patient. It was the lovemaking of two people who had learned, bone deep, how close loss always stands. It was vivid because it was honest. There was no shame in it. There was no hurry. It was mouths meeting, breath uneven, body speaking a slow, steady, unequivocal yes in the small, safe home they had built with their own hands. It was an anchoring, a claiming of life. In late May, they officially opened the way stop. Eli carved a simple sign from a piece of cottonwood and hung it from the platform eaves. Dawson, Spur, way stop, coffee, biscuits, staples. The section hands, who were busy repairing the line Vance had neglected, were their first customers. Then came the riders from nearby ranches, checking new fences. The coffee was always hot, brewed in a big blue enamel pot. The biscuits, as Eli liked to say, were sometimes perfect. Mara kept the shelves Eli had built stocked with the necessities: 100-pound sacks of flour, beans, slabs of salt pork, tins of coffee, twists of tobacco, and cartridges for a half-dozen different rifles. It was a store, but it was more on nights when the weather turned, when a late storm blew in, or when the wind howled with the voice of the empty plains. Mara set a single lantern in the front window. It burned a steady, yellow flame all night, a promise. It was a light that could be seen for miles, a beacon in the place where there had been only darkness. One evening at dusk, just as Mara was preparing to close, the new bell over the door jangled. It was Mrs. Thorne, the preacher's wife. She had been one of the hardest faces in the loft, one of the loudest whisperers. She stood just inside the door, clutching her reticule, looking nervous and small. "Good evening, Mrs. Thorne," Mara said, her voice even. She wiped her hands on her apron. "Good evening," the woman stammered. I find I'm in need of salt. A pound of salt, if you please." "Of course." Mara went to the barrel, measured the salt into a paper sack, and folded the top. "That will be 10 cents. Mrs." Thorne walked to the counter and placed the coins down. With them. She pushed a small, folded piece of notepaper. She would not meet Mara's eyes. "Thank you, Mrs. Delaney," she whispered, grabbing the salt. She hurried out the door as if she were fleeing a fire. Mara stood there for a moment. She looked at the note. She unfolded it. The handwriting was a neat, slanted script. It contained only 3 words. I was wrong. Eli came in from the back room, where he'd been mending a harness. "Who was that?" Mara didn't answer. She held the small piece of paper, the ink still fresh. She looked at it for a long time. Then she walked over to the new shelf, where she kept her sales ledger, the one filled with columns of coffee and beans, and she tucked the note inside, between the pages, like a pressed, dry leaf. The railroad, eager to restore its reputation and its profits, put the spur line back on the main schedule. The first pay train in nearly 2 years was scheduled. It slowed as it approached the siding. The engineer, a big man with a face permanently stained with soot, blew the whistle. A long, cheerful salute. Men, section hands, railroad guards, and agents were leaning from the windows of the caboose. They waved. The engineer saw Mara, who had come out onto the platform, wiping her hands on her apron. He didn't sneer. He didn't look away. He leaned out the window of his cab and, with a broad, human gesture, he tipped his greasy cap. Mara, startled, felt a smile touch her lips. She raised a hand and waved back. Eli watched from the doorway. Progress, he thought, wasn't just iron and timetables. It was that. It was small courtesies, stacking up, one by one, until they became something strong enough to stand on. The town, in its own slow, clumsy way, sought to make amends. At the edge of the small cemetery, near the 2 simple wooden crosses that marked the graves of the section hands, a new marker was set. It was not paid for by the railroad, but by a quiet collection taken up by the farmers and, surprisingly, by Reverend Thorne's congregation. Mara and Eli walked there one clear Sunday. After the sound of the church bell had faded, the stone was simple, clean granite. The carving was new. It read, Thomas Hayes William Porter, and Jacob Delaney, beloved son, lost in the Dawson Depot. Fire, 1887. They had given him back his name. They had acknowledged him. Mara knelt, her hand tracing the sharp, new-cut letters of her son's name, beloved son. Eli stood beside her, his hat in his hand, his shadow falling over her. He stood as a witness. The grief came. It rose in her, not the sharp, agonizing guilt of the schoolhouse, but a great sweeping wave of pure sorrow. It was the grief of a mother, clean and terrible. It passed through her, like the wind passing through the high prairie grass. She knelt in the bright sun, and she wept, finally, for the boy she had lost, her shoulders shaking. After a long time, she stood. She wiped her face with her handkerchief. She looked at the stone. She felt lighter. The weight was not gone. It would never be gone. But it felt as if it were no longer hers alone to carry. It was shared, with the stone, with the land, and with the quiet, steady man standing beside her. Rumor, Eli found, doesn't vanish. It just gets tired. The whispers about Mara Delaney, the firebug, faded. They were replaced by new rumors about the price of beef, about the new teacher coming from back east, about the way-stop station that served the strongest coffee on the line. People came. They came for staples, and they stayed for conversation. They sat on the stools and talked about the weather, about their crops, about their families. Laughter, real and easy, started to sound normal in the small shack. It was no longer a fortress. It was a home. The news from Cheyenne came in clipped sentences over the telegraph wire. The trial of Silas Vance was swift, convicted on all counts. Fraud, arson, conspiracy. His appeals, filed by a new lawyer, were denied. He was sentenced to 30 years in the federal penitentiary in Leavenworth. He was a bad chapter, finished and closed. The summer came on, hot and dry. The plains cured to a deep, dusty gold. The nights were still, the air warm and smelling of sage. Far off, the coyotes sang, their voices a high, lonely chorus to the stars. One evening in July, after they had closed the way stop, they sat on the edge of the platform, their feet dangling, just as they had that first night. The air was soft. 1,000,000 stars were scattered like salt across the black sky. "It's a big sky," Eli said. He had been quiet for a long time. "It is," Mara said. She leaned her head back against the platform post. He reached over and took her hand. His was calloused, scarred, and familiar. "Mara," he said, his voice low. "When I first came here, I was just a traveler, looking for shelter for one night. You told me, you said if I stayed, you'd tell me the truth." "I did," she whispered. "I've been thinking about that," he said. "And I've been thinking about that lantern, the one you keep in the window." She waited, her heart suddenly loud in the quiet. "I can't imagine this place without that light," he said, his gaze on the far-off horizon. "And I've come to realize I can't imagine the lantern without your hand on the match. I don't want you to stay here because you have to, or because you're hiding from the town. I'm asking you to stay, because I cannot imagine this place, this home, without you in it." She turned to him. In the faint, silvery starlight, he could see her face. She was smiling. It was not the bitter, tired smile he had first seen. It was not the pained, fragile smile of her grief. It was a smile that broke across her face like the dawn on new snow, bright and clean and full of promise. She said yes, not with a word, but by pressing her forehead to his, her hand coming up to cup his jaw, the rough stubble of his beard familiar against her palm. They sat there for a long time, shoulders touching, watching the darkness soften over the high, empty plains. They were two stubborn, scarred survivors who had found each other in a storm and had taken an abandoned, broken place and built a home. Thank you so much for listening to our story. If you stay tonight, I'll tell you the truth. We love hearing from you. So please, drop a comment and let us know where in the world you're listening from. If you enjoyed this story, we hope you'll subscribe to From Wild West for more stories just like this one. And please, share your thoughts with us in English. We read every one.